Welcome. I am Maisha Gillens, Executive Director of Equity and Accelerated Student Achievement. I am the mom of girls that are ages 7 and 11. We are excited to have this conversation this evening about how to have conversations about race with children. For some, this conversation is very difficult. Many of you may not want to say the wrong thing or just don't know what to say at all. You may be thinking you are not an expert of the subject of race. Well, we are here to tell you that neither are we. We are parents who have elementary age children, and we are willing to have an open dialogue tonight about how each of us approach conversations about race with our own children. So why now? My answer would be, why not now? We have been catapulted into having this conversation. We have publicly seen racist acts in the media. We are publicly seeing protests across the country. We are publicly seeing discussions occurring around race and racism on the news. Companies are speaking up and speaking out. School systems and county agencies are also speaking up and speaking out against racism. I am pleased to partner with Kristen Caminetti. She and I have collaborated on presenting to parents at a local elementary school on how to talk about differences and social justice standards to elementary age children. It has been a pleasure having open conversations with Kristen about equity, differences, race, and social justice issues. I am really excited about this very important dialogue this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Gillens. I've had the honor of working with Dr. Gillens, as she said, on a number of seminars on talking with children about differences. It has been an honor. She is immensely knowledgeable, engaging, real, and open. Working with her is a pleasure. So when recent events started to unfold, Dr. Gillens and I started to talk. With the increase in outrage over police brutality against Black people, and what appears to be an increased desire from white allies to do more and do better, we were also seeing a lot of parents who were hungry for information on how to talk to their kids about these tough subjects. So Dr. Gillens and I started to talk about doing a forum like this. It is our hope that this forum will give parents who are new to having these conversations greater comfort and less trepidation in doing so. And we hope everyone watching, whether you're new to these kind of conversations or more experienced, that you'll gain some new tools to make the conversation richer. We're really thrilled to have 4 additional panelists here tonight, and we'd like them to introduce themselves now. Isa?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Isa Van Zen. I'm the proud father of 3 boys, 2 of whom go to school here in Crofton. My 6-year-old is headed to the 1st grade, so this is a timely discussion that I'm proud to be a part of.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Katara West. I'm the parent of 2 pretty amazing kids, 7-year-old daughter named Gabrielle, and an soon-to-be 9-year-old son named Ryan, and I'm equally as excited to be here with you tonight.
Good evening. My name is Brian Whitley, and I've been an educator for the past 23 years. I'm also the proud father to 2 sons, a rising 5th grader at Folger Elementary and a 4-year-old, and I'm excited to be here tonight.
Hello, I'm Jessica Wilson. I'm the mother to 2 girls, a 8-year-old and a 6-year-old.
Thank you. So I'm going to review the expectations for our dialogue this evening. And the expectations truly aren't just set for this evening, but anytime you enter into a dialogue that you may find difficult or you may not have the words for it. So the first thing is to be honest, be open. We oftentimes use the language of speaking your truth, right? Speaking about your own experience. And with that, oftentimes you have to lean into a conversation. Someone's truth may be something that may be hard to hear, or you may not understand. And so we ask that panel members, along with the community, when they're entering into difficult conversations or conversations they're not comfortable with, is don't exit the conversation. Lean in. If you wonder, ask. If someone says something that causes discomfort, ask questions. I wonder why, or can you give me more information as to why you said that, or what led you to believe that, or what was it about your lived experience? So again, instead of running from a conversation, we're asking that you lean in. And again, if you wonder about something, just ask. We do ask that you're fully present in the conversation. In order for dialogue to happen, we have to listen, right? Not be prepared for that next response back. That we really have to be present and truly seeking understanding to what the other person is saying. And that goes along with listening for understanding. And call people in to the conversation. This conversation isn't about shaming. Again, as I said, no one's an expert. We're all learning this. I'm sure many of you, if you have older children, you look back going, oh, I wish I could have done some things different, right? As a parent. I know my mother apologizes to me all the time about some mistakes she may have made along the way, but it isn't about shaming, right? It's really calling people in to have this really, really important dialogue.
So as we move on, I realize with so many starts and stops tonight, I don't think I actually told you who I was. So I am Kristen Chiminiti, founder of Kindness Grows Here, and I have 4 kids, ages 10 to 2, in case I didn't say that this time. So before we really get into the conversation, we just wanted to share a few general tips in talking about difficult subjects with your children. So having conversations with your kids about difficult subjects can be scary and a bit intimidating. And I've seen parents who think, oh, I don't know enough, or I'm not an expert, and so they just don't start the conversation. But the reality is that there are only 2 things you need to be an expert on. The first is your child. This simply means knowing what they already know. So before you start to have a difficult conversation, ask them what they know. They might surprise you. This also means knowing your child's cues. So when you're having a conversation, if they seem overwhelmed, that's when you know to take a break. The only other thing you need to be an expert on is having an open and honest conversation. You don't have to know exactly what to say and exactly how to say it. It's okay if your kids see you struggling a little bit. And when you are struggling, be honest. Let them know what's hard about it for you. The most important thing you can do right now is start having these conversations. So a few other tips. You can move to the next slide. Use age-appropriate terms and explanations. The amount of detail you use with a 4-year-old will be very different from how in-depth you go with a 10-year-old. And one way you can know how detailed to get is by letting your children ask questions, and then be sure to only answer the question your child asks. So to use an example that may bring similar fear and trepidation, if your 4-year-old said, "How are babies made?" you don't immediately jump into the detailed mechanics of sex, but you might say, "A woman has an egg and a man has a seed, and they put them together and a baby starts to grow." And that 4-year-old might say, "Oh, okay," and move on. But another kid might ask a follow-up question and another follow-up question and another follow-up question. And you answer each of those questions step by step. So when talking about race or racism, you can give simple explanations and then say, what questions do you have? You can start with basic books and then get more detailed. And I guarantee that in having conversations with your kids about race, racism, violence against people of color, and other related topics, your kids will ask you questions that you don't know the answer to. It happens to me all the time. And when this happens, you can say, wow, that is a great question. I don't know the answer, but let's find out together. And lastly, remember, it's not good enough to just talk the talk. You can't just talk about fighting racism. You have to do the work. So that means that when you're in the grocery store with your kids and you hear someone say something racist, you have to model for your kids what it looks like to step in and help. If you're at a school event and you see a child or an adult saying or doing something that's racist or insensitive, you have to step in and model the behavior that you're going to be talking about. All the talk in the world, won't matter if you're not putting it into action. So those are our tips to get us started. And now we're going to go into a review of some definitions.
Yes, thank you, Kristen. So review of definitions, we believe really important. We call it level setting, making sure that we're all clear and on the same page to different terms or definitions we'll be using tonight. And some of these terms may be used by one of the panelists, or maybe Kristen and I will use some of these terms. And we just want to make sure that we all have a common understanding as to what these terms mean. We also are going to break down the terms by student-friendly, elementary age, child-friendly language, and then adult language. So you will notice there are going to be some differences with how we are unpacking some terms that we may be using this evening. So the first term is race. And again, we have this in a different color in blue, just to show this is how you could potentially talk about race or define race to an elementary age child. So race is putting people in categories based on what they look like. Some races you may have heard of are Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, and indigenous people. Race doesn't tell us anything about a person except a few details of what they might look like. Race doesn't tell us who a person is or what they can do. Race mostly seeks to describe people based on the color of their skin. So again, that is the child-friendly definition. And so here would be the adult definition to unpack race. Race, like gender, is a social construct. The differences we see with our eyes, differences such as hair texture and eye color, are superficial and emerge as adaptations to geography. Adaptations to geography. Under the skin, there is no true biological race. The external characteristics that we use to define race are unreliable indicators of genetic variation between any two people.
So now we're going to move into the definition of racism. And just keeping in mind, as Dr. Gillens mentioned, so many of these concepts are really complex. So we are not going to ever get into all the intricacies of each of these definitions, but we kind of want to just have a basic understanding so we're all on the same page. So the blue definition here, again, is for young kids. And you could describe it as racism. You could say it's important, make sure that you give clear definitions that kids can understand and don't mince words. So you can say racism is when someone is hated, excluded, or treated badly or unfairly because of their race or the color of their skin. With slightly older children, you might go into more detail about what racism looks like and how it leads to events like the death of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery. As adults, and for much older children, it is important to understand that racism is not just the actions of individuals, but rather it is a societal system of collective prejudice backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control. So the key word there is power. Racism is one group having significantly more power than another. And it is that disproportionate distribution of power within society that leads to massive injustices in policing, the criminal justice system, education, distribution of resources, and so many other areas of our society. And yes, racism is also those individual comments and microaggressions that people of color deal with on a daily basis. So our next definition is anti-racist. Talking to kids about race and racism can be sad and scary. So it's really important to give them a sense of hope and confidence that they can do something to help. And that's where this word comes in. Teaching children what it means to be an anti-racist gives them the power to make a difference. For young kids, you can say, being an anti-racist means doing everything that we can to stand up and fight racism. And as adults, we must understand that being an anti-racist isn't a label that we earn and keep. It's something we must strive for every day in all of our actions. It means working to actively recognize racism, to respond to it, and to actively seek to dismantle racism by speaking out against racist acts, policies, and practices. So recently in the news, the Black Lives Matter movement has finally been getting the attention and support that it deserves. And it is really important to understand how this movement started and what the goal is. The Black Lives Matter movement started in response to state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. It is a movement to unite Black people to seek justice in their communities. And it is also an opportunity for white allies to unite behind Black people to support this effort. Black Lives Matter doesn't imply only that Black Lives Matter, but it is a saying that makes sure everyone knows that Black lives matter just as much as every other life, because for too long, they haven't. So those are the definitions that we wanted to start with. And now Dr. Gillens is going to go over the way we're going to be asking questions for the more conversational part of this discussion.
Yes, so since we did have technical difficulties, if we were live, we would have participants viewing to place their questions in the chat box. We have Maisha Walker here this evening with us, who did notice there were some questions before we went offline. And throughout, as the panelists are answering some questions, she will make the determination if whether or not it's a new question that came in the chat box that she would like to also pose to the panelists this evening. And so again, we do respect time. So we're going to leave that up to Maisha Walker to make that decision as to what questions can be read, again, based on our time. And so the next slide shows the participants, the questions. Next slide. So the questions that will be asked this evening of our panelists are: what made you accept our invitation to participate in this panel? How old were your children when you first started to talk to them about race? What did you talk about? What are some resources you have used for talking about race with your children? Have you ever had to have a particularly difficult conversation about race with your children? And if so, what did you discuss? And what would you most like other parents to know about talking to children about race? And just for aesthetics, if we can minimize the PowerPoint, and so each of the panelists can be seen on a larger screen, that probably would be best. Great, thank you. So each panelist, and in no particular order, we can always do the order in which I can see you on my screen, which is always fun because you don't see what I see. So I'm going to start with Katera. So again, the first question is, what made you accept our invitation to participate in this panel?
Thank you, Dr. Gillens. Let me just start off by, again, saying thank you for having us. I truly appreciate the opportunity that this event has afforded all of us to, have the opportunity to share our experiences, our successes, our failures, and talking to our young children about race. I accepted this invitation for two reasons. The first of which is because I understand that the experiences that my Black children have in the society they grow up in is a function of many things, including people's willingness to talk to their own children about race. And if all children aren't being taught the truth about race and racism, then children of color will continue to bear the burden that we've bared for centuries. Our kids go to school and play and socialize in ways that they interact with others all the time. Some of them look like each other, some of them don't. And I need those spaces that my kids occupy with other people to be filled with teachings of love and support and encouragement and understanding, and not that of hate and of fear. And if I can help others find ways to create those spaces, well, you know, that's what I'm here for. And as a Black mother, I can't afford to, and my kids can't afford for me to kind of sit idly by and wait for history to repeat itself. The second reason that I accepted this invitation is to let parents and caregivers know that we aren't perfect. We don't have all the answers, but because we hold the livelihood and the development of our children in our hands, we have to show up at this time, at times like this, for topics like this. We have to show up. We have to give ourselves grace, but we also have to hold ourselves accountable for creating the experiences and confirming information, refuting information, and filling in the gaps for kids where we need to.
Thank you, Katera. Isa.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me once again. I guess at the end of the day, I understand that our children are, you know, our greatest contribution to society. And whatever I can do to create a world, to create an environment that's favorable to everyone to participate and feel welcome, I'm more than willing to do so. I think the time is always right, given America's history, to have discussions like this. I think for far too long, we've neglected to engage directly in these type of discussions and exchange ideas and understandings and misunderstandings about this topic. So I'm here to listen. I'm here to share what I believe I understand, so that hopefully we all can come away with a much better understanding of how to address this issue for our youngsters.
Thank you. Jessica.
Thank you. And thank you, like Katera said, for the opportunity to be here. It's a very promising start of what I hope is an ongoing conversation. I accepted partially because my first instinct was say no. These kinds of things make me very uncomfortable, but I'm trying to, you know, model for my own children that it's important to step out of your comfort zone and take the time, sort of like Katera said, to show up and to speak up. And again, to show them that you don't have to have all the answers to contribute, and that it's important when you're invited into a space to share your experience. And so that was the main reason I ended up saying yes, and also kind of reiterating what has already been said, to listen and learn and just share what we do in our house, as in hopes that it's helpful.
Thank you. Brian.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for having me, and thank everyone who's turning into this important conversation. I'm here for several reasons. First and foremost, it's an important conversation to have, and it's timely. Not, like Isa said, it's always the time, but now more so than ever, I feel. I primarily wanted to talk to white parents in the audience and challenge us to do more. Author Robin DiAngelo says that racism is a white problem, and white people created racism, and therefore it's up to us to dismantle it. The past few weeks have been yet another wake-up call. I studied and taught history, and sadly know there's isn't the first time, and we must acknowledge the past. We must acknowledge the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and then be reminded what happened 5-6 years ago with Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin. And before that, in LA in 1992, Watts in Detroit before that, the Tulsa Massacre, the Wilmington Massacre. I could keep going, but we have to acknowledge the past if we want to stop this. White parents have to talk about race with their children. For too long, most white parents have opted to avoid the conversation because it's difficult and it's uncomfortable. But we have to do more. As Dr. Angela Davis said, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. During the recent uprisings, there was an uptick in people quoting Dr. King, most of it incorrectly, and cherry-picking certain quotes. But I challenge you to read all of Dr. King's work, and for me, what is relevant is his words to the white moderates in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And I quote, "I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. who constantly says, I agree with you in your goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods or direct action. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So why am I here? To hope that parents out there, and white parents in particular, have these conversations with their children early and often. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to know everything. It's okay to not have all the answers. You're gonna mess up. But it's not okay to remain silent or treat it like a taboo subject. We cannot continue to sit back and encourage that negative piece that Dr. King referred to. We have to choose the difficult path, and this is why I'm here. I'm excited to have this discussion, and I'm hoping that along with the discussion tonight, it continues and action occurs with it long after we're done here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are thrilled to have all of you. I think we're just, we're really lucky to have the four of you here who are so willing to share your experiences. And so thank you so much. So moving into those questions, the next one is, how old were your children when you first started to talk to them about race? And what did you talk about? So Brian and Katera, I think you guys were going to kind of take this question. So does one of you want to go ahead and jump in?
Sure, I'll start. So as a Black mother raising Black children, I feel like I started teaching my children about race from the day that they were born. From the books that we read to them as infants, the music we listened to, the images we showed them, the places we take them, the toys that we bought them for, for birthdays and for holidays. And in all of that, we were intentionally teaching them about race. Unfortunately, caregivers and parents of Black and brown children know all too well that our kids don't have the luxury to just be here. We understand the world doesn't always love us, doesn't always support us, doesn't always encourage us. So we have to do that as parents. For me, my first sit-down conversations with my kids were very different. For my son, it's kind of hard to pinpoint the first time because I feel like he's always asking questions and having comments about that topic. So our conversations never really felt like one-timers. His grandmother is a tour guide at the National Great Blacks and Wax Museum in Baltimore. And I mean, they pretty much grew up there. And so they go on tours there so much so that, by the age of 6 years old, he knew the exhibits well enough to give a tour with his grandmother whenever they would have elementary school age children come to the museum. And so, he'd always talk about the things that he learned and what he's seen. And so when we talked about that, in the spirit of empowerment, we really talked about the people of color and we focused on the figures that he saw and their accomplishments. We didn't really give a whole lot of energy on the people that did harm or, treated people badly. So our focus was a little bit different. I do recall one time, however, when he was about 6 years old, we were at the dinner table and he was saying the grace as usual. He did his routine prayer. And then at the end of it, he said, God, please bless the white people, even though they're being mean to Black people. And so I had to kind of like do a double take, right? And I said, well, what's going on? What do you mean by that? So I asked him why he said it. And he said, well, mommy, he said, they need help because they were just so mean to us. And then he went on to tell us about some lessons that he had talked about in school about the civil rights movement. And I need to mention right here that for him in the schools that they went to, these conversations were being had all along, throughout the year. It wasn't just a one-time thing, wasn't, during a particular month. So I felt like, for him, this was kind of building up. He kept saying, how it wasn't fair and, why would they do that? And to be honest, I didn't go into the political or the economic powers or whatever at play. But what I did offer him was that sometimes people don't like us because of what we look like or because of what we have or what we don't have. We talked about slavery and Black people, how Black people were treated unfairly. But at the end of the day, he had reference points. Like he had something that he could draw on. So having conversations without something to draw on, I think really is a futile effort. We really have to expose children early to different things so that when you have those conversations, they have something to come back to. I think about the breakdown of how we retain information, right? 10% of what we see, 30% of what we hear, 50% of what we see and hear, 75% of what we experience, and then 90 to 95% of what they teach, right? And so by 6, he had already seen and heard and taught, and so he'd kind of done all those things. So he really was able to internalize our conversation. And I think that over the past few years, as he's grown a little bit more, he's read a little bit more, he's seen more, his questions have more turned into emotions. And, you know, he's seeing what's going on. And so our conversation really has shifted to, it's okay to feel like this, to have those emotions, but what are we going to do with them? You know, how can we turn these emotions into action? For my daughter, the race journey was a little bit different for her. She grew up with the same exposure, the same environment as her brother, heard the same conversations, but she is more reserved. She's a processor, so she kind of holds things in, and she's not as vocal as her brother is. So for her, I guess our first sit-down conversation about race actually happened last fall. So about 3 years ago, she got pretty heavy into dance. And so a relative has suggested that we go to this particular studio. It had the days that we needed. So we said, okay, we'll do it. So I agreed, knowing that she would be one of very few Black dancers at that studio. And so it was a conscious decision for her to go there. It was an intentional move for me because we want our children to, of course, interact with all kids. But at the same time, she needed to know that she was just as good and could do all the things that I know our world doesn't always tell Black and brown children that they can do or that they're supposed to do. She's on the competition team, and she has, you know, and she's also a soloist. And so it was important for her to know that, you know, she could compete and she could win against anybody. And so she, you know, they do lots of things together. They have birthday parties and they travel together, and, you know, pool parties and sleepovers. And so this past fall, on the way home, she just kind of breaks out in tears, and she's like, "Mommy, I feel different." And she just starts crying on the way home about how she just feels different because she's the only Black girl in her class and on her team. And so we went through a series of questions, and, you know, did they say something to you? Did they do something to you? Something hurtful to you? And she said, no. She said, but I still don't feel quite right. So, you know, I acknowledged what she was feeling, and I let her know that, yes, there are some physical differences, you know, but you like the same games, you know, watch the same TV shows, but she still wasn't, you know, she still wasn't feeling it. She said, you know, there's still something that just doesn't feel right. And so what I think she was really trying to say is that I don't belong here because I look different than everybody else. And so for me at that moment, I just needed her to understand that, yes, they might look different than you, but you are just as important. You're just as good a dancer. You know, you're right where you belong. And so, you know, to answer the question, what did we talk about? Like, we talked about the dynamic of being different, right? Like how dynamic she can be in her difference. And so as a Black mom, you know, my conversations about race really have to have components of empowerment. Like, we can all tell our children that there are different types of people and that we should be kind and loving, but if the systems that are in place still have practices and policies that elevate some and you know, put down others, then our children are always going to suffer. So I think my talks about race really serve as buffers for my children in times when they feel like the world really doesn't get them. So at this point in time, I can't say to them, don't worry, it's going to be okay, because I don't always believe that myself. And so, you know, instead I try to give them the information that they need, but then also the emotional tools that I know that that's going to be required for them to kind of live in our society today.
Thank you so much, Katera. I'm really struck in what you shared about how much your children at such young ages internalized the racist message that our society sends, and how they picked up on that so easily and so quickly. And I think that's really important for all of us to hear. So thank you. Brian, do you want to share your experiences?
Yeah, as an educator, you know, I had the advantage of understanding the importance of exposing kids to new information early on. And So when it came to race, I try to make a conscious effort from a very early age, that even finding, baby board books with diverse kids in it and people from around the world, to see new images and different ideas in different places. But, that alone isn't enough. You have to point out those differences and make it a conscious thing, and celebrate those differences in a positive way, and make sure that, the kids see the differences and the positives and the differences. But you have to take an effort. We just did a presentation that showed that 80% of children's books feature white characters or animals, right? Like, that's just shocking. So that means there's only 20% of books out there that have diverse characters. So, buy diverse books, advocate for diverse books in your children's school. And research shows that kids notice race by age 3. They notice differences in people. So whether you want to talk about it or not, the kids are going to notice. So if you're not saying anything, a parent's silence, body language, that says a lot to kids. So, I highly encourage parents to be mindful about those things. So with my own kids, we would read, we would talk about things, we would point out things. I often hear people say that they teach their kids not to see race, and the colorblindness is not helpful. And if we teach kids colorblindness, then we not only, missing out the wonderfulness in our differences, but we're also not getting them able to see disparities. They're not able to see racism later. And it's hard to counteract that impact of racism if they don't understand what the differences are. If they're taught, and this is what I did with my kids, is that yes, people are different, but that's a good thing, and that's a wonderful thing, and people are bringing different things to the table. That's what we need more of. It makes it easier for them to navigate the world, and it makes moments like we're living in now a lot easier. Have I been perfect? No. There's been a lot of mistakes along the way. I've said things. I haven't always handled stuff. The kids will bring things up, and then they'll say things in a weird way, and you got to try to explain to them why what they said might be offensive. But making sure you have that conversation, just don't let things go, has to be a constant effort. It's not just a one-time conversation. It can't be, we read this one diverse book and that was it. But for my kids, from early on, we've talked about it. We've been open about it. We talked about differences. We've talked about valuing those differences. And the earlier you start that conversation, the easier it becomes for difficult conversations later. So the fact that Nolan and I have been talking about things for a long time now, when he saw something happen, with the events of George Floyd and everything in the news recently, we were able to have a much deeper conversation about what was happening, how that plays in societally, things that he, as a 5-year-old, wasn't ready to talk about, but as a 10-year-old, he's more willing to ask questions and understand. So I really encourage parents out there to start early and know it's never too late to start having these conversations, but have them consistently, keep going, and don't shy away.
Thank you, Brian. The point you mentioned that really, I think, is one to really drive home is that importance that we shouldn't teach our kids not to see color. We should teach our kids to see all the beautiful colors of the world and to celebrate those differences and to appreciate them for making the world more interesting and better. One conversation I know that I have with my children too is that I try to talk to them about how the conversations that we have, we're lucky, they're very different than the conversations that Black children have to have with their families. So, I remember a couple years ago, I attended an event at Arundel High School, and I remember a gentleman standing up. It was a book reading with April Ryan, and a gentleman stood up and shared a story about how his children were, I think they were like 3 and 4, and he'd already had to have the conversation with them that when you go in a store, this was a Black man, that when you go in a store, you don't put your hands in your pockets because somebody will think that because you're Black, that you might be stealing something. And that's a conversation I'd never even thought about having with my children, that my parents had never had with me. And that really struck me. And so I've had the conversation with my kids about the fact that those are conversations that Black children have with their parents because those things really happen. And so it's something we talk about that, if we were in a store, what would we do if we saw somebody following a child around because they were Black? And what would we do? And what would we say? And how would we step in? because, you know, being kind is stepping in for those who might need our support and might need to see an ally, to know that that they're not just being judged all the time. So, you know, making those conversations very real and kind of highlighting how lucky we are as white people to not have to have certain conversations that Black people do have to have at a very young age because of the way our society has judged people of color for so long. So thank you both, Katera and Brian. And now I'll go on to Maisha, who will go on to the next question.
Oh, can I answer that one? I swear I'll be quick.
I'm sorry.
No, because you know, I have to tell you, my story is a very interesting story. I remember this. My daughter was daycare age. So what's that, 4? When you're in daycare, 3, 4 years old. And we were talking about her teacher, and she said her teacher was yellow, right? Because, you know, they're all about crayons. And I said, well, what color is mommy? And she said yellow, well, her teacher's white. And that was an aha for me, like, oh, wow, my child does not realize that her mommy is Black, right? It's when we talk about even complexion and what that looks like. And so I remember at 3 or 4, that was kind of a punch in the gut for me. I'm like, oh, what did we not do? Did we not talk about this? For her to color me, you know, categorize me as yellow, as the crayon, right? Because they're at that age, they're very literal, right? As far as attaching colors to the crayon box. And so that really struck me. And again, when we talk about making mistakes as parents, I'm like, wow, clearly we must not have had that conversation about race and how beautiful that Black people come in so many different of shades of color, and for her to associate that again with her white teacher. But I also want to add to this conversation, and to your point, Kristen, the conversation sounds very different from a Black family versus a white family about race. And one of the things that is so important, and I need for white families to hear this, is if you have a Black child where society is already judging you for how you show up every day, that conversation from that parent's perspective sounds very different. So when we talk about self-esteem, self-image, self-worth, these are the things that we as Black parents have to make sure we instill in them. Because if you walk around and how people perceive you, that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I just want that to settle in for a minute, because if we allow, right, racist viewpoints to dictate how Black children view themselves, that does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So for, again, my conversation with my girls sound very different than a conversation I would say that a white family would have with their children. So I'm now on question number 2. Thank you for allowing me that moment. The question is for Isa and Jessica. What are some resources you have used for talking about race with your children?
You care to go first, Jessica, or should I? Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Well, I guess right off the bat, I start by using the mirror. I use the mirror. I put my children in front of the mirror, and I constantly point out just how special they are, how beautiful they are, and how they need to appreciate who they are from top to bottom. They are special. They are beautiful. And that's not to say that I teach them that they're any more special or beautiful than anyone else, but before you can love anyone else, appreciate anyone else, you have to love yourself, appreciate yourself. I don't believe that would just happen if I were to just let my boys just sit in front of TV and choose whatever they want to watch. It would not happen. They would not get the kind of affirmation that they should get and should receive. So I make the conscious effort to make sure, first and foremost, I sit them down and then make sure that there's nothing about them that they should change, that they are capable. So constantly just trying to reaffirm them, to have confidence in who they are and in their abilities. I also model behavior for my kids. And I live in a diverse community, and I interact with kids and adults from different backgrounds all the time. And again, with no hesitation whatsoever, I treat them all the same. And my kids do a great job in following suit. And that to me is a testament to the job that I'm doing. They tend to spend a lot of time with who they enjoy spending time with. And sometimes it's kids that are happen to be Black, and sometimes it's kids that aren't. And again, it's wonderful to just watch them play with who they want to play with. Okay, so I don't place restrictions on that, and I really just encourage them to enjoy the company of people. Period. Another thing I try to do is to be as present as possible, and you could say hypervigilant to a certain degree, but I try to be present with my kids and pay attention to what is around them and what could potentially have an adverse impact on them. So yes, I pay attention to what kind of books they read in school, what kind of things they talk about. And it's funny because my son just read a book. It's called Giraffes Can't Dance. And the book was nice, but there was a part in that book that struck a chord with me. And these are the kind of things that left me wondering, like, how many conversations are happening in other households about this one particular line. It said, now every year in Africa, they hold a jungle dance where every single animal turns up to skip and prance. Now, again, at first glance, we think that what's so harmful about things like that? Okay, we might probably just glance over it. But to me, I had a conversation with my son. I said, now listen, Africa is a big place. I know it's a children's story, but it's a big place with many, many, many diverse people. Because again, this is not this alone is not the thing that can sort of single-handedly bring about racism, but this is definitely part and parcel and emblematic of some of the things that we need to nip in the bud immediately. Okay, Africa's an enormous continent. It's not a monolithic culture. Okay, and we need to make sure that children, all children, and I know especially my own, will understand that, because I teach my kids to be proud of who they are, and part of that is being an African. Okay, so I tried my best to be as present as possible in my kids' life early on, and I encourage them to interact with people and to appreciate people who they spend time with and who they choose to spend time with. Last but not least, I do discuss history with my kids as well. They can tell you about, the Tuskegee Airmen and what have you, but I try to take it back even further than that. We might be discussing the pyramids and just getting them to have those type of concepts floating in their mind, again, to sort of, bring home this sentiment that there's a lot there to be proud of. And again, that's not something that they're probably going to get consistently outside of this household. So I try my best to drive that point home, again, through modeling, through teaching about history, truth in history, and just being as present as I can for them, because again, they can't see it. They're not going to see it. So it's my job as a parent to see it for them and to use and capitalize on those teachable moments. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm like, Jessica. Thanks,
I was,
Jessica.
I wasn't sure. I apologize. So I think I think in terms of resources, I think similar to what's been shared before, we in our house is full of books. My husband and I read a ton. Our kids are exposed to, we have bookshelves and books and baskets of books all over the place. And we have always made an effort to ensure that those books are representative of lots of different kinds of people. Also, representative of historical events and things that are going to sort of prompt our kids, or hopefully, create some opportunities for us to have conversations about things that have happened in the past in America, but also thinking about contributions of people from different races or different cultures, and again, creating those opportunities. I think we in our house really work to balance using books as an avenue to talk to our kids directly about race and racism, but also to sort of normalize that it's not all about the bad things that have happened to people or those things, but that there are also stories about Black and brown kids having fun just like you do and doing the things that you do, and that's normal. And I think, again, similar to what Esau said, modeling that in how my husband and I engage in our social lives and our personal and professional lives as well. But in terms of like specific resources that we use as a white family talking to our white kids about race, there's a particular, I think there's one of the things that's come out of this sort of, I think Maisha put it as, Dr. Gillens put it as, catapulting us into this conversation, is there's a million book lists that have been curated. One book that I think is really useful is this book called Not My Idea. It's a book about whiteness and white privilege for white kids. It's been helpful. It's very direct. I think it was helpful for me to process it first. We talk a lot about, with our older daughter who's 8, a lot about the importance of reading books about groups of people written by people from that group. So we talk about a lot about the Own Voices movement, right? So really pushing her. And one of the things we're doing with our girls this summer is we always do a summer reading challenge. And this year we found one called Read for Change. It's called the Diverse Summer Reading Adventure. And so it's a bingo board, and it has things like read a book about a Latina character written by a Latina author. Read a book illustrated by an Indigenous artist. And then we talked about, what does Indigenous mean? And why was it so hard to find a book illustrated by an Indigenous author? And those are conversations we're having with our 8-year-old, but also, with our 6-year-old. We also, my kids are addicted to YouTube, for better or worse, and more so even now that we haven't been in school in 3.5 months. So YouTube Kids has a pretty good curated list of videos that we've looked at, and some questions from Common Sense Media that we can talk about. I'm a former social studies teacher, so I'm also very big into talking to them about history and utilizing resources from other teachers, and 2 teachers that I really like. And I think Kristen, put together this list and is going to share it. But one is a woman named Lanisha Tabb, and her counterpart, Naomi O'Brien. They each have their own websites, and they've created guides for talking to your kids about race and racism for white families, and another one for families of color. Those are not free resources, but they're amazing, and I think totally worth the money. And they also have some really great social studies lessons as well that I've used with our kids. And I appreciate being able to tap into those resources to give me some guideposts and ways to think about the content before broaching those subjects with our kids. The other resource I use all the time is called The Conscious Kid. If you're not familiar, it's a great resource. They have tons of free resources, but you can also become a patron and get some additional resources, which I find very useful.
Hi, everyone. We did have a question from the chat, and that question is, do you recommend Ibram Kendi's children's book, Anti-Racist Baby?
I would say yes. I had the opportunity actually to view his video. He had an interview where he actually had his daughter on his lap during this 1-hour video. and it was on this topic of how to talk to your children about race. And I would say his daughter's like 4 years old. And she was a typical 4-year-old squirming around on his lap as he's doing this interview, and he read the book. So I know it may be on back order at this point, but he did.
It's actually not out yet. It not publishes, but whatever the launch date, I think it's July 12th.
There you go.
It's a great book. It rhymes, so kids always love rhymes, but it actually is very meaningful. I mean, it's not just, some rhyming books can quickly get very kind of just cutesy, and Anti-Racist Baby does not at all. It really is very empowering and gives specific actions that kids and parents can take to work towards being an anti-racist. So yes, pre-order it, and it'll show up at your door on, I think, July 12th.
Right. And the video, just for the viewers to know, the video, which is on YouTube, where he's reading the book towards the end, is called Raising Anti-Racist Kids, Empowering the Next Generation. Maisha, is there another question?
You're muted.
We do have another question from the chat, and the participant acknowledges that this may be a tad bit off of our focus topic, but they were wondering about how would you respond to unkind parents or parents who were expressing bias? What would be an appropriate response?
We don't want to all jump in at once. Tara, were you about to say something?
Yes, I would say, first and foremost, the children's safety is the most important thing. So if there's ever, a time where a parent is being irate and belligerent, this is, and you have the opportunity to get your children out of that space. For me, that's what I would do first. And then you need to first of all think, do I want to engage this person at all? Right? We have to really use that power of discernment to see whether or not they're going to be willing to engage, or do they just want to argue with me? And if you can discern that they do want to engage with you, then I'll use what one of our student panelists said a couple of weeks ago, where we don't want to call people out, but we call them in, right? We call them into the conversation and ask more. Dr. Gillens alluded to this in the very beginning in her introduction, but we really start to ask them the questions. If they are calm enough where they can talk about it and want to talk about it, well, it's okay to disagree. We're not always going to have the same ideas. So why do you say that? What do you mean by that? Why do you think that? So for me, I think you have to first of all decide whether or not to engage, because sometimes people just want to get a rise out of you. Sometimes people just want to see people get upset and then perpetuate stereotypes they already have in their head. So, for me, I decide whether or not I'm going to even, have that conversation with you, period.
Yeah, Katera, I was going to say something very similar in terms of I ask questions a lot. I think that's a good on-ramp to trying to unpack what's going on, and can sometimes I don't make it feel not as, it often sort of breaks down those defenses, right? But can still help get across the message that it's not okay. So yeah, I agree. I think questioning is a really strong way to start if you choose to engage, which I think is an important point that you made.
We do early dismissal professional development, the four early dismissal days, and for your students, staff, we're engaging in equity professional development. And one of the professional developments we did was based on teaching tolerance, speak up. And it was about speaking up against comments that are hate-based or biased or prejudice. And one of the strategies is to question. It's also to educate. Sometimes people may say biased things and they just need education on what the word means or the implications or the impact that has had on me. Another strategy is echoing. If someone speaks up, it's always nice to have an ally to echo with you. as to what is said. So again, teaching tolerance is another resource to help adults to speak up and out if someone else is saying something, again, that's disparaging, offensive, et cetera, and in a way that's respectful, right? In a way that's respectful.
I think the question, you know, when I hear that question, I largely wonder, are they talking about if an adult is saying something unkind to another child?
Oh.
And I don't know how the question was intended, but to Katera's point of getting a child to safety, I think part of that getting a child to safety is making sure that child knows that there are people who will step in and speak up for them. And, you know, I talk a lot running an organization about kindness. What does kindness really mean? And, you know, I think sometimes people confuse kindness with being nice. And I think being nice means you don't rock the boat, you don't say anything, you just kind of get away from the situation. But somebody who's kind isn't afraid to rock the boat and to step in and speak up and to speak out. And so if this was an instance where an adult was saying something unkind to a child, as long as, you know, obviously that everybody was safe, it's so important to step in that case to make sure the child gets that message that just because that's an adult, that's not okay. And that, you know, other adults are going to step in and make sure that that person knows what they said is wrong. So, Maisha, as long as you don't have any other questions from the audience right now, we'll go ahead and move on to the next one we had planned. Great. So the next question that we had was, have you ever had to have a particularly difficult conversation about race with your children? And if so, what did you discuss? So Brian, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, yeah, excuse me. I remember having a conversation with my oldest son when he was about 5. He was either pre-K, kindergarten, and he comes home and he has an assignment that they did about Martin Luther King, and he came home with a little book that they made and about Dr. King. And they evidently learned that he had given a speech and they'd given a dream. At the end of his book, he was supposed to share their dreams. So this kid being my kid, his dream was to eat pizza in bed. So I was like, wow, that's very, so I say in my sort of sarcastic way, like, not quite what Dr. King had in mind, but that's cool. So him being a 5-year-old goes, well, what did Dr. King have in mind? So I go, okay. So I look at him, I say, well, you know, I start to a brief explanation of the civil rights movement and try to think about how to explain that to a 5-year-old and saying, you know, there was a time when Black people were legally discriminated against because of the color of their skin. So then he looks at me and goes, well, that still doesn't happen, right? And I go, oh, well, actually, you know, I quickly thought, do I say the easy thing and go, no, yeah, things are fine now, the laws are changed. So, but I said no. I said it's different now than in Dr. King's time, but people are still badly treated by the color of their skin. Kind of hoping that might end the conversation a little bit, but him being like me, he goes, well, why do white people treat Black people so badly? And that's, you know, I just pause, right? And you're like looking at him and he's 5 and he's got these like, he just wants to know. So, and I really wish I could say I had this hugely profound, succinct answer. And I probably stumbled a little bit and I don't even remember exactly what I said, but you know, it was something to the effect that in the United States, things aren't always fair to all people and that there are white people who do not believe that everyone's equal, but we don't believe that. We love all people. So at that moment, he had enough and ran off and was, you know, got distracted by something else. But it wasn't just a one-off conversation. Like we just have that one-off conversation that's not helpful. So we could build on that. And like Isa mentioned before, like I've made sure that as he reads tons of stuff. So we made sure that biographies weren't just of the civil rights movement or weren't just of slavery, but positive. You know, I came home with the Tuskegee Airmen thing, and we talked about that. We've gone to diverse experiences. So we've modeled behavior for him. So that one difficult conversation about what was going on becomes easier than last week. He was on YouTube and he stumbled across the news about what was going on with George Floyd, and we had already talked about it, but he saw some of the video, and that's not necessarily something I wanted him to see, but we had talked about it. So we had a good conversation the other day coming home from soccer practice talking about race as a social construct. So I can have that conversation as a 10-year-old, that because we started these conversations as 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds, as we talked about before. So I would say, don't shy away from these conversations, and don't always go the easy route. Don't be afraid to you don't have to sugarcoat things. And there's ways to have discussions based on the age of the child to make it, and it'll make things easier as they get older and things get deeper and they start to see inequity. And he starts to recognize that himself now and says, hey, that these things aren't fair, and I'm seeing this now. So I'm hopefully, I talk to him a lot about the work I do. So I'm hoping that he will be empowered to speak up and speak out for others, because that's another big theme that we've talked about, saying that we do have these privileges. Like, we've been afforded this because of the color of our skin. That's not right either. Like, so we need to focus and say, what can we do to help others? So, it's a process, and not something that happens one night and with one conversation. Like, oh, done, we've solved racism in my house, but it's something that we work constantly for.
That really illustrated the point of letting kids ask questions. You said he asked one question and you answered a little bit, he asked a little more, and then and also you read his cues. You could tell when he kind of had enough, and you put it down for that day, but then you picked it up the next day or the next week or 5 years later when it was even more in depth. So
yeah,
thanks for sharing that.
He never got the pizza in bed, though. That never happened. So that dream still remains unfulfilled.
Tara, would you like to take a stab at this one?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, as my son gets older, he's starting to have more emotions over questions. And so I think he's really just starting to kind of connect all the dots in his head as it relates to race. So, I think he's really processing the things that he's been shown and what he's heard on TV, what he's learned at school, and, what he's read, and then what he's being taught at home. And it truly hurts him when people are not acting in ways that are in direct contrast to what he knows is right. And so lately, some of those emotions that he's been feeling has been the emotion of anger. And so one of our toughest conversations really just happened this past Monday. So this summer is the first time that he is the only Black student in a class. So my children attend predominantly, they attended predominantly Black parochial school and now predominantly Black public school. And so he is taking a virtual songwriters course. And so on the first day, this kid who loves to sing, loves to write music and songs and all that good stuff, make up songs, he had this look on his face after the first day. And, I'm like, what's going on, bud? And he says, Mommy, I just hate it. I just hate it. I'm so angry. I'm so angry that I'm the only one here. And so, I said, well, why the anger? Tell me, talk about the anger just a little bit more. And he says, because I know what they're thinking about me. And so, I said to him, in my head, I'm thinking, well, wow, how does he know what they're thinking about him? You know what I mean? And so, so that kind of sparked some additional conversations. And, I said, well, I know what he already knows. So to your point earlier, Kristen, we know what our children already know. And so we talked about the idea that there's certainly going to be people who don't look like you, who aren't going to like you for the way that you look. But we can't generalize people. We can't put people in buckets, right? We have to look at people individually and not really generalize the behavior by one particular group. But I need to be clear that although, I teach them to look at people as individuals, I also teach them that if somebody showed you who they are, you have to believe that. And, as an educator for years, I've seen all too often where our students of color kind of buy into the self-fulfilling prophecy that Dr. talked about earlier, when they start to believe the things that people say about them and say who they are. And they still call these people their friends, and they still, want to hang out with them because they live in the neighborhood. But, I'm teaching my kids that you still have to discern behavior from, what's good and what's bad and how that makes you feel. You're not going to stick around and continue to befriend someone who clearly at that moment or for that period of time does not appreciate you. And so for me, that's important. So, to be able to talk to him about that anger. So for me, I think that the difficult part of the conversation is more so, how do I help him work through that anger that I know that he's feeling? So, here we are 3 days later, he's a little less angry, just by interacting with the students more, he's collaborating with them, recording with them. And, I say all this to say that the tough conversations, in order to have them, we have to acknowledge what our kids are feeling. We cannot push their feelings aside. We have to acknowledge what they're feeling and know that, give them spaces where they can talk to you, they can come to you. My children are very comfortable in talking to me about most things that are race related. My kids come to me with things even in their schoolwork that they don't agree with. And so, just building those spaces for them to be open is really, really important. I think also that in order for us to have the tough conversations, we really have to understand kind of where we are. Kids, we don't give kids enough credit. We really don't. Kids are prime, like their brains are primed to learn. It's the adults who are fearful, right? And it's when we really cast those fears, our fears on them, that we're really doing them a disservice, because if we don't talk about these things, then the children don't get a chance to do things like critically think and problem solve, right? And show empathy. All the skills that we say we want children to have, if we're not having conversations about race, they're not getting those skills. And so, we want our children to, walk away with, certain things. Well, we have to give them certain things. They're not going to just get it from the world. And so, we have to give them those experiences so that they can practice. We have to check ourselves, where am I with this? How do I show up to this conversation? What do I really feel about this? Because how you feel about it is going to come across to how you talk to your children about it. And I think we really have to be committed to consistency. Many people on the panel have already alluded to, this not being a one and done. We have to be able to engage in those conversations all the way through. Like these conversations, they're not a checkbox, right? So we have to continually have these conversations and be mindful of the messages that we're sending, right? And the messages that we're sending don't always come from our words. They come from our actions and our modeling. And so, as you think about having the conversations with your children, the tough conversations, just keep in mind the modeling behavior, reflecting on your own personal beliefs and practices, right? And just showing up for them. But I know for me, the tough part is just knowing how hard and how much it hurts him. No parent ever wants to see their children hurt. And to know that he's scarred by some of the things that he sees and some of the things that he hears. And so, just trying to manage that as a parent is difficult. But, again, we show up all the time. And so we're going to keep chipping away at it.
Thank you so much, Katera. I with all your stories, I'm just really struck by when you said that for your son who's older, it's just becoming so much more about emotion and cueing into those emotions. And I think, related to that, like you said, that as parents, we need to be very aware of our own thoughts and feelings and emotions when it comes to race. And so at the end, one of the, on the list of resources that we share, it's not just a list of resources for how to talk with your children about these things, but there's also some resources there for adults of books that they can explore to have a better understanding themselves. Because while we said you don't have to be an expert on race to have the conversation with your child, it still is very important to explore these concepts and to really do some soul searching, particularly for those of us who are white, to acknowledge, our how our experience is different, in some ways privileged, because of the color of our skin, and to kind of really, some of those ideas can be really hard to kind of grasp when you first hear them. They can be jarring, and it's really important that we have those conversations with our kids, and before doing so, kind of take some time. Jessica was saying one of the books she used, it was really important for her to process it first. And I think that that's true with so much of this, that we want you to have the conversation. We don't want you to be scared to have the conversation, but we also want to make sure that you take the time to kind of be honest with yourself about your own past experiences and your own feelings and emotions, because you can't be honest with your kids if you're not first honest with yourself. So thank you for bringing that point to light.
Thank you. And I have the last question. It's for Isa and Jessica. What would you most like other parents to know about talking to children about race?
You care to go this time, Jessica?
Sure, I'll go this time. Thank you. So I actually asked my kids this question when we were talking at dinner last night about why I was going to be preoccupied this evening, and I said, what would you say? And I was laughing a little bit to myself when Kristen, when you were sharing at the beginning your tips, because it was like my children read the PowerPoint. So my 8-year-old said to not be too sophisticated, which I think is a new word for her. So to keep it simple, and even though it's really serious, to remember that kids don't always want to talk about serious stuff for very long. So that was my 8-year-old's advice. And my 5-year-old's advice was that, even if you feel nervous, because I had mentioned at dinner that I was nervous to do, this panel, and it was a little anxious. Even if you feel nervous, you should do it anyway, because it's really important and you have to face your fears. So a little insight into she's 6 now, actually. She just turned 6, my 6-year-old's brain. So, I would agree with them, and I think echo what's been said, which is that I think it's never too early and it's never too late. And so wherever you are, I think if you haven't started, start and process yourself, but don't be afraid to let your children see you processing and learning as well. I think it's a really important part it's been a really important part of our journey with our girls. So that's what I would say.
Well, I would add that, for those parents who experience any kind of trepidation or hesitation about speaking directly to race, I guess an alternative route or indirect route might be to just teach your children to value everyone, period. So value cultures, people from different cultures. So that way, hey, you're not directly saying, this is black, this is white, but again, if you're out and you are at a restaurant having ethnic food, don't just enjoy the food. Talk about the people who made the food and enjoy conversations and appreciate the people who actually, created the culture. I think oftentimes that feeds into our misunderstandings about race. It's like, for me, part of it is like race is on the end. It's like, the culture. Let's appreciate the culture and the people within the cultures. And then, if race comes up, then we address it. But I think on a macro level, let's value cultures. Let's value the people within the cultures. And then, if race is a part of that, then so be it. But, if you're out having, experiencing, cultures outside of your own, enjoy it, have a good time, and remember to appreciate the people who that culture flowed from and appreciate them as well. I would also say that, again, going back to being present and having a presence of mind, I think it's important to also point out that they're good and bad people, so to speak, in terms of just keeping it simple in every culture. Every culture has its good and bad people. And, again, if, you're constantly watching TV and, in retrospect, you say, well, you know what? The good guys always seem to look like this, or the bad guys always seem to look like that. Point that out to your kids and say, well, you know what? I know we see a lot of this, but they aren't all good, or they aren't all bad. So I would encourage you to come to the defense of other people from other cultures, especially if, they are stereotyped a certain way, and you notice that in your movies or what have you. So, again, everyone is not one way. Folks from one culture, you're not all in one, category in terms of whether you're good or bad. And you need to drive that point home constantly and religiously. So that's all I have to add on that point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Kristen, do you have any last words before we move on to the resources?
I don't think so. I think Jessica and Isa really summed it up for us. So
Yes, they
thank you.
did. Thank you.
And I should say Jessica's kids as well.
Of course.
So we can get the PowerPoint back up. We need the resources page. And as that is coming up, we did create, because it's now what, right? We've had a lot of dialogue. The dialogue was amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're now providing some resources for families to enter into this conversation or to continue it or take it to the next level. And so where the resources can be found here, you'll see there's a URL at the bottom, www.aacps.org/letstalkjustice. And what you will find are a list of children's books on race and racism, fostering diversity and celebrating differences. You'll find books for parents on social justice, anti-racism. You'll find articles, videos, websites on social justice, anti-racism, and articles, videos, and websites with tips on talking to kids about race. And so again, we didn't want to leave this conversation without leaving you with tools to either continue the conversation, entering into the dialogue for the first time, or just taking it to the next level.
Just to clarify real fast, so it's at that address that you see, and then on the left side of the page, there's going to be a link that says resources. So click that link that says resources, and then you'll see there's a list after that, and you'll click the one that says talking with children about race and racism, and then it'll pull up a PDF with all the links to a ton of great resources.
Thank you. And our last slide. I want to say thank you, but Kristen, I would love for you to read this quote, but definitely thank you, panelists. We heard you loud and clear. You were excited about the conversation, but you're kind of nervous, right? Sharing. But I know that your words were gifts to many, 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 many families. And so hopefully you take comfort in knowing that. And I personally want to say thank you for that. And of course, thank you to our media folks for recording, for hanging in there with us. We had to shift gears, but that's one thing about us and who we are. We kept it moving. We made it work. And thank you for those behind the scenes. And of course, Maisha Walker, who was there to read and capture those questions and comments that came through. So thank you.
Yeah, so as Dr. Gillen said, your words are gifts to many people, including me. So thank you to each and every one of you for sharing your stories and your conversations with your kids. I can say all of your kids are so very lucky to have you. Again, to the thank yous, there's a lot that goes into preparing a forum like this behind the scenes, and there's a lot of people that are involved. So Bob Mosier and his team, and the graphics people who create the graphic and all those things. There's just a lot of work and a lot of people involved in making this happen. And that even when there's glitches, there's those things that are somewhat out of our control. So I just want to thank everybody that was involved in pulling this together. We really appreciate it. Dr. Gillen sent me this quote when we first started planning for this, and we both agreed that this kind of captures the message. And so it says, expand their experiences through the activities they do, the conversations you have, the people you interact with, and what they read and watch. And I think our panelists tonight touched on each one of those things. and about how important it is to just get out there with your children, have these important conversations, and make sure that they're interacting with all different kinds of people and reading books by and with pictures of all different kinds of people and watching shows and videos that show the diversity of our world. And as Isa pointed out, that when it doesn't show it accurately, point that out too. So just keep having those conversations. Don't be afraid to do it. And the world's going to be better because of it. So thank you all so very much.